There's actually 3 Isaiah scrolls found among the Dead Seas, in the Qumran community at the Dead Sea. And they're well preserved. They say almost exactly the same thing, that the later what's called the Masoretic text, or the Hebrew text that has vowel points and dashes. Very few of your watchers are not going to know about Morse code, but it's a universal code used by military. Dots and dashes, when you could send out telegrams but couldn't speak words, and so you could send out this to ships during war and this kind of thing. You put in the dots and dashes, and that's what these Hebrew letters look like. Hebrew is a consonantal text. It doesn't have any letters, but the Masoretes in the 9th century AD added vowel points. They're dashes and dots under the manuscripts, on top of, in between. And the way we read the Hebrew is in light of those vowel points, but the text is almost identical to these Isaiah scrolls. It's remarkable. The Dead Sea Scrolls were written somewhere between 100 BC and AD 70. And to have these Old Testament scrolls that are, in fact, even before 100 BC, for some of them, to have them like that is really a great value. But there are no New Testament manuscripts among the Dead Sea Scrolls. There are a few in Cave 7 that are in Greek, and some scholars have tried to say those are from the New Testament, but no, they are not from the New Testament. Most people, they're small scraps. We've identified what some of them are, but none of them come from the New Testament. So what do we have for the New Testament? Well, the main discoveries that have happened in the 20th century, the major discoveries, are of the papyri. And it started in the late 1800s by 2 young scholars, Grenfell and Hunt, from Oxford University. They went to Oxyrhynchus, which is a dead town in Egypt, high above the water plain, and they started excavating at the city dump of Oxyrhynchus. And what they discovered were these old papyri that had been preserved in this dry climate of many, many things. To date, we have approximately 1 million papyri that have been discovered, not all at Oxyrhynchus, but a large portion of them at Oxyrhynchus. And Oxford University has about 500,000 of these. It's a fragment, it's a papyrus. It could be as small as a postage stamp, could be as big as 200 pages. That has writing on it. So beginning in the early 20th century, we start to see Grenfell and Hunt excavating and finding more New Testament papyri than they were found at other sites. To date, we have, I believe the number is up to over 140 New Testament papyri. Well, out of 1 million papyri, that's not a whole lot. But here's the thing. In the 200s, some would even date it earlier than that. So it might be as early as, the late 2nd century, but probably these 3 manuscripts, in fact, there's 5 manuscripts I want to talk about, are all papyri. They're very large papyri. We have papyrus number 47, written in the mid-200s, we believe, 3rd century, that has 10 leaves intact from the book of Revelation. It has about half of the book of Revelation in it. And what's interesting is this papyrus agrees largely with the manuscripts that come a couple centuries later, that we would say these manuscripts are the best witnesses we have to what Revelation says originally. And here we have a manuscript 200 years older than they are, and it agrees with them. So we know we're on the right track because we get witnesses that are earlier. And then you have another manuscript, P45, which has 32 leaves, and most of them are pretty intact. It's a leaf of, I don't think I can show this on here. It'd be too hard to show you, but if anybody goes to want to look at these papyri, go to csntm.org, and then go to manuscripts, and you'll have books and manuscripts, and you click on manuscripts, and then it gives you a search engine. Type in P45, no spaces, or P46, P47, P66, or P75. Those are all 3rd century papyri that have extensive material from the New Testament. So P32 has parts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts. And it remarkably is so close to these later manuscripts that we consider our best witnesses. And so it's been very, very valuable. To have 32 leaves of this is incredible. P45, P46 is the gold standard of all these in terms of how much material it had. It had the letters of Paul originally. It was originally written on 104 leaves, or that makes 208 pages. Of those 104 leaves, we still have 86 of them almost entirely intact. You might get 10 or 20% of it that has just disappeared from being in a garbage dump and use and things like that. But we have 9 of Paul's 10 letters in P46, and quite a few of these have had a huge impact. Like 1 Corinthians and Hebrews, they're almost totally complete manuscripts. And we start looking at P46 and we see the later manuscripts, and we can even see places where P46 has a wording that must have been developed before the 3rd century, but our later manuscripts, Vaticanus from the 4th, Sinaiticus from the 4th, Alexandrinus from the 5th, and some others, has wording that goes back even earlier than P46. You can make these comparisons. Okay, then you have P66, which was discovered in the 1950s. These first were discovered in about 1930. And CSNTM has photographed the P45, 46, and 47. We have really good images on our website. So P66 was found in Egypt, and it's at the Bodmer, or it was at the Bodmer Museum in Switzerland. And P66 has most of John's gospel in it. It has the oldest title to any book of the New Testament in it. It says the gospel according to John. And yet we know that was not what was originally put on John's gospel. Most likely, the 4 gospels were anonymous, but they were early on associated with these various apostles and other writers. And so the 2 manuscripts that we rely on the most, Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, it's called O1 or O3, or Aleph and B are the letters that are used for these manuscripts. Those manuscripts give the title for the Gospels, not the Gospel according to. They just have according to Matthew, according to Mark, according to Luke, according to John. They don't call it a gospel. And the Gospels were originally anonymous, then they began to have names associated with them. And that's the same name universally. There's no exceptions. In the patristic period, John is always called by John, Luke by Luke, Mark by Mark, and Matthew by Matthew. But here you have 4th century manuscripts that have an older title than even a 3rd century manuscript. But P66 gives us most of John. And then there's P75. P75 has most of Luke and most of John. And it's a remarkable manuscript. That manuscript agrees more with Codex Vaticanus in the Gospels than any 2 manuscripts for the first 8 centuries. That's remarkable. And P75, it was put up for sale several years ago by the Bodmer Museum in Geneva. And Yale University offered them $50 million for this papyrus, and they turned them down. And it ended up going to the Vatican, probably to get people out of purgatory for a few more centuries, I think. That's what the Catholics believe. But That manuscript is absolutely remarkable. The scribe was writing 2 letters at a time. He wasn't concerned with making it look pretty. He was concerned with making it accurate. So we use these early witnesses and we compare them with complete New Testaments by the 4th century. And we realize that they preserve a very primitive text. And what we know is that in Alexandria, Egypt, there was a copying process that started in the 2nd century BC that said it was the copying, it was the book printing capital of the world, of the ancient world. Books came out of Alexandria, and the Alexandrian library, world famous, it had virtually every book that had ever been written. And it got destroyed later. But Alexandria was the place for the most accurate copies of books. Scribes were told, do not add anything to the words, do not take away anything from the words, and you must make it as accurate as possible. Even if you like some more words that you see in the margin, don't put those in. We have a very early stream of transmission that is a very careful stream of transmission and usually goes back to the original wording, many times just by a handful of manuscripts. The papyri are the big thing for us, but not just the papyri. There's a manuscript in a monastery on a peninsula in Greece that's from the 10th century, and it's called Codex 1739. Well, 10th century, that's in the 900s. That's a long ways away from the original. How good is it? Well, this manuscript of much of the New Testament, especially the Paul's letters and things, this particular manuscript has patristic commentaries written throughout around the text, and it seems to dutifully cite church fathers up until a certain point. Basil the Great from the 4th century is the last church father that it quotes from. And so if the scribe is putting in these quotations or comments from the church fathers about the biblical text, and the scribe stops at Basil the Great when there were many, many great fathers who came after that, that gives us a hint that perhaps it's a direct copy from a late 4th or early 5th century manuscript. And it just so happens that it is the most important manuscript after the 5th century that we have. And it's every bit as important as a couple of our 5th century manuscripts, Alexandrinus and Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus. So this is really stunning stuff. We find more manuscripts. They may be late, but they're copying from a very early copy. And so by sifting through all this evidence and comparing things, we realize we can come back to the original text with at least a 99% certainty of what we have. And what we have is either in the text or in the footnotes. That's pretty amazing to think about. When you're looking at some of the other ancient writers, like Livy, the Roman historian, I think he wrote 140 books, and we have only 35 of them left. So you've got scholars that when they study some of these historians or playwrights or poets or politicians or those who are philosophers, the oldest copy for almost all of these comes 500 to 1,000 years after they were written. Think about that. Our oldest copies of Josephus, 9th century, 800 years after he was written for his Jewish wars. And I'm sorry, not for his Jewish wars, another work, but the Antiquity of the Jews is what it's called. For the New Testament, we're not waiting 800 years before we get a copy. We are waiting decades before we get a copy. We have in the 2nd century, maybe as early as the first quarter of the 2nd century. We can't be sure. These manuscripts don't have dates in them. Some do, but not from those early dates. And there's ways to determine by comparing a manuscript that does have a date written in it with the ones that we have discovered that don't have dates. We can determine the date pretty accurately with that. Think about this. the Gospel of John, the last of the Gospels to be written, has manuscripts from the 2nd century, some within just a few decades. The oldest manuscript we think is still the oldest one is papyrus number 52. And it's a very small manuscript. It's about the size of a credit card. They number the papyri in terms of their publication. So this was the 52nd papyrus published in 1935. And the scholar who published it, C.H. Roberts, had been bequeathed a shoebox full of papyri with a lot of letters in them by the man who had worked on earlier papyri at Manchester University in England. C.H. Roberts gets this shoebox in 1944 or 34, and he goes through and he sees, here's a papyrus that has writing on both sides. Now that's unusual because the book form that we have up until the late 1st century, and we have no examples from the late 1st century, we do have Martial, who is the one who is credited with making the first modern book, the Codex, a book that has binding on one side and it's got 3 sides. It's like our modern book, basically, Codex. That's the birth of our modern book. For the next 5 centuries AD, only less than 15%, about 14% of all non-Christian books were written on a codex. They were all written on a roll. And that means they were written on the inside with the fibers going horizontal. During that same early 5 centuries, over 90% of all Christian books were written on a codex. And so when C.H. Roberts came across this manuscript, he didn't know all these facts at that time, but later he wrote about it. He gave some lectures at Oxford, got published, and about the significance of these finds. He discovers it in 1934, publishes it in 35. He sees writing on both sides, and it just so happens to be that he deciphered it. And on the front side, it has John chapter 18, verses 31 through 33, or parts of it. The ends have broken off. But on the back side, it has John 18, 37, 38. Well, what does that tell? It tells them that this book had to have been part of a codex, not a roll or a scroll. Why? Because the vast majority of scrolls or rolls were written only on the inside. And what's written on the outside is called an epistograph, written on the inside and the outside, is typically something else altogether. But if it's the same manuscript, we have a few that are like that. Let's say you had a manuscript of John's Gospel. Well, you write on the inside, you take it about halfway through. Then you write on the outside, you take it about halfway through to the end. So the middle to the end. You're not going to get John 18 on one side and John 18 on the other. You will get that if it's a cut page. And we can tell how big the page was and how many leaves it took to write John's Gospel that were in P52. So Roberts published this in 1935. And at the time, the popular view of John's Gospel was that it was written sometime after AD 160, probably 170. That was kind of the European consensus. It all started 90 years earlier than C.H. Roberts' discovery by Ferdinand Christian Bauer, or F.C. Bauer, at Tübingen University. And I don't know if you've ever heard of Hegelian dialectic. His professor was Professor Hegel at Tübingen, who invented Hegelian dialectic. Now, this is very common in the West. And I don't know if you know this, but we say there's a thesis and then there's an antithesis. And when these two interact with each other and they finally come to agreement, there's a synthesis. Okay, well, it's well known in America. People don't know that that's called Hegelian dialectic. And so you've got, like when the United States Constitution was written, there were parties that said one thing, parties that said other. One side said it has to be like this, another said it has to be like this. They came to a meeting of the minds in the center and made a synthesis, a compromise. And today, the political scene in America it doesn't seem like they're even wanting to talk to the other side. It's just a mess in this country right now. But that's Hegelian dialectic. Okay, so F.C. Bauer applies this to the New Testament. He's a philosopher, he's a theologian, he's not a historian. And based on Hegelian dialectic, he sees the school of Peter as representing some of the books in the New Testament, the school of Paul that's representing others. The very Jewish view by Peter, the very Gentile outlook, because Paul was the missionary to the Gentiles. And they are butting heads. They disagree with each other. There's contradictions in the Bible he sees, or he claims to see. The synthesis is when the book of Acts, which shows Peter and Paul both in a good light, and it's about the acts of Peter and Paul. It's not about the acts of all the apostles. And then the Gospel of John that seems to synthesize all this. He put both of those books after AD 160. And he also said, we don't have any early manuscripts of the New Testament, so how can we tell what the original said? Sounds like Bart Ehrman today, doesn't it? There was a man by the name of Tischendorf, Konstantin Tischendorf, who was born in 1850, and he was a German scholar who dedicated his entire life to finding older manuscripts of the New Testament to counter F.C. Bauer's argument that we don't have any early manuscripts of the New Testament. What did he discover? He discovered Codex Sinaiticus at the St. Catherine's Monastery at the base of Mount Sinai in Egypt. And it's the oldest complete New Testament by 500 years. It's now in the British Library. It has a long story about how it got from St. Catherine's to the British Library. But that manuscript is our second most important manuscript in the world for the New Testament. And so he found something that was earlier. And it really made it hard for Bauer's views to keep going. Bauer died in 1860, I think, and Tischendorf died in 1874. So they were roughly contemporary. So let me back up here and say, back to P52. So Bauer, on his philosophical construct, dates John's Gospel about 170. It has no historical value as far as he's concerned. And as far as European scholarship was, especially German scholarship, was concerned, in the from that point on, from 1834 or 1844 until 1935, when C.H. Roberts discovers this little scrap of papyrus. He sends photographs of it to the three leading papyrus scholars. They're called papyrologists and in the world. And they each wrote back to him independently of each other and said, this manuscript cannot be dated any later than AD 150 or earlier than 100. But they'd say, we're comfortable with that range, 100 to 150. How can you have John's Gospel written in 170 if you have a copy of John's Gospel written in 150? What this did, this tiny scrap of papyrus did, it was an ounce of evidence that disproved a couple of tons of speculation from the Bauer school. It destroyed it. So this one small scrap of evidence all of a sudden pushes John's Gospel back into the first century. And there's been other things. And I wrote an article that got published in Biblical, which is the Vatican's official scholarly journal, some years ago, about a verb in John 5, where I think John is indicating that he's writing this gospel in the 60s, but most put it in the 90s. Either way, we have 50 papyri of John's gospel that are all very early, and they don't differ that much from each other. So that's one of the great discoveries, but it's been the papyrus discoveries overall that have been really important. Other discoveries are what happened at St. Catherine's in the 20th century. Sinaiticus was found there in the 19th. But in 1975, there was a fragment of a manuscript sticking out of the mud walls St. Catherine's gets about 2 or 3 inches of rain a year. That's it. So it's a very dry climate, perfect for storing manuscripts. They just don't decay because of that, not very much humidity. And this monk pulls out this piece of manuscript and says, "Oh, how did this get stuck in the mud well? It may have rained or something, and it revealed this." So they dug a hole into the wall and they found a hidden room there. 1975. It's called a Geniza. What they discovered in there was a massive trove of manuscripts. 1,200 manuscripts were discovered in that hidden Geniza, and 50,000 fragments of manuscripts were also discovered. It is the largest discovery of manuscripts in the history of the world, making St. Catherine's Monastery the second largest library for ancient manuscripts, just after the Vatican. Really, really something else. And it's right out there, way out in the desert, 8-hour drive from Jerusalem. So when they got all done, now these are manuscripts of all sorts of different documents, but in 1999, they published a catalog, all in modern Greek. They may have made 200 copies, and then they published one in English. And I've got, I think, 2 in English, and I was given the manuscript or the book in Greek. And so I've been to St. Catherine's. I was there. I got to look at these new finds manuscripts, and I discovered 2 more manuscripts that were inside the ones that they had. Sometimes it's, after a certain page, you get a different manuscript in there. You don't know until you go through these manuscripts painstakingly and read the whole thing. So that was the biggest discovery. It was about 90 Greek New Testament manuscripts out of that whole thing. It also had some leaves from Codex Sinaiticus from the Old Testament and from the Apostolic Fathers. It had Genesis through the book of Revelation, originally a whole Bible. And it also had the Apocrypha, which the Catholics accepted as scripture, and some stuff from the early church fathers at the end. Magnificent discovery. There was another discovery, the second largest discovery in the last 50 years, was in Albania. And that was in 2008, when CSNTM went to Albania, to Tirana, the capital. And we were told there were 13 manuscripts there. We got a tip on it. So we asked if we could digitize them. They said yes. And when we got there, we discovered there were dozens more Greek New Testament manuscripts. So we discovered somewhere between 25 and 30 manuscripts. It's hard to tell with some of them because there were a few that had gone missing since World War II. And some of these may have been those same manuscripts, but this made international news. I was interviewed by 100 newspapers worldwide, and Wall Street Journal interviewed me. Some other major things did, places and journals. But this is the second largest discovery, and it's helped us to reconstruct the history of the text. These things are magnificent. And as I said, CSNTM has discovered more than 75 manuscripts, which is adding to that fund. It's really exciting.